The history we are taught is a neat story. In 1347, rats on Genoese merchant ships brought the bubonic plague to Europe, and a third of the continent died. It is a simple, terrifying narrative of fleas, rodents, and a bacterium named Yersinia pestis. But what if that story is wrong? What if the creature that brought medieval Europe to its knees was not the plague we know, but something else? Something faster, more contagious, and a horror for which we still have no true name. This is not the story of a disease we understand, but of a historical black box, an unsolved plague whose true identity may be lost to time. The textbook narrative is compelling. It begins in the east, travels along the Silk Road, and explodes into Europe at the siege of Kaffa in the Crimea, where Mongol armies allegedly catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the city walls, the first recorded act of biological warfare. From there, it boarded ships and spread with terrifying speed. The symptoms described by contemporary chroniclers like Giovanni Boccaccio seem to fit the classic profile of bubonic plague. He wrote of the telltale gavoccioli, the swollen, agonizing lymph nodes in the groin, neck, and armpits, the buboes. He described the fever, the delirium, and the swift, almost certain death that followed. For centuries, this was the accepted truth, a closed case. The culprit was Yersinia pestis, the agent of modern bubonic plague, transmitted by fleas from black infected rats. But when you look closer at the medieval accounts, cracks begin to appear in this neat story. The first and glaring anomaly is the speed. The Black Death moved with the speed of a wildfire, not a slow-burning infection tied to the migration of rats. Modern bubonic plague, even in the worst outbreaks, moves slowly. It is a disease of rats. Humans are an accidental host. It might take months or even years for it to spread across a region, limited by the speed at which infected rat colonies can travel. Yet the Black Death raced across Europe at an average speed of 1 to 5 miles per day, even in winter, when fleas are dormant and rats are less active. It reached remote, landlocked villages with no known connection to major trade routes. It even crossed the Alps in the dead of winter. How could a rat and flea-borne disease accomplish this? Furthermore, many contemporary accounts describe a disease that was transmitted directly from person to person. The Florentine chronicler Agnolo di Tura wrote, "It seems that this plague was so potent that it was transmitted by the breath and by sight, and so they died." Doctors and priests who tended to the sick died at astronomical rates, suggesting a pathogen that could be passed through the air from one human to another with terrifying efficiency. This sounds far more like pneumonic plague, a variant where the Yersinia pestis bacteria infects the lungs. But pneumonic plague is incredibly rare, even during bubonic outbreaks, and it is also notoriously difficult to transmit. An infected person is usually bedridden and coughing for only a few hours before death, severely limiting their ability to spread the disease widely. It cannot account for the explosive, continent-spanning nature of the 14th century pandemic. And then there are the symptoms. While the buboes were certainly a prominent feature, many chroniclers describe other horrific signs that don't neatly fit the bubonic model. They speak of a sickening odor emanating from the sick, of extreme neurological symptoms, of dark spots covering the entire body, the tokens that gave the pestilence its name. Some modern researchers, comparing these descriptions to known diseases, have pointed out their chilling similarity not to bubonic plague, but to highly lethal hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola. Diseases that cause massive internal bleeding, are transmitted directly between humans through bodily fluids, and have a mortality rate that approaches the near 100% figure reported in many medieval towns. The neat story of rats and fleas begins to look less like a solid explanation and more like a convenient assumption, a case of mistaken identity that has lasted for 700 years. The central pillar of the traditional bubonic plague theory is the rat. The narrative requires a massive, continent-wide population of black rats living in close proximity to humans to act as the primary reservoir for the disease. There is just one problem. The archaeological evidence for this rat apocalypse is almost non-existent. Extensive archaeological digs at 14th century sites across Europe have failed to uncover the vast quantities of rat skeletons one would expect to find if they were the primary victims and vectors of the plague. In fact, in some regions, rat bones from that period are conspicuously rare. This inconvenient fact has led some historians and scientists to propose a different animal culprit. What if the host was not a rat, but a more common rodent, one that doesn't rely on human trade routes to travel? Some researchers have pointed to the gerbil, whose populations in Central Asia are known to fluctuate with climate patterns. Using tree ring data, they've shown that the climate in the years leading up to the Black Death was favorable for a gerbil population boom in Asia, which could have allowed the disease to spread before being carried west. But this still doesn't fully explain the blistering speed of its transmission once it reached Europe. This has led to the most radical and controversial theory of all, that the Black Death was not bubonic plague at all, but an entirely different disease, perhaps one that is now extinct. The late zoologist Graham Twigg and the sociologist Samuel K. Cohn Jr. were prominent advocates of this view. They argued that the combination of its incredible speed, its high human-to-human transmissibility, and its terrifying mortality rate simply does not match the known epidemiology of Yersinia pestis. Cohn, in his exhaustive study of thousands of first-hand medieval accounts, found that the symptoms and the seasonal patterns of the Black Death were radically different from those of later, confirmed bubonic plague outbreaks in the 17th and 19th centuries. The Black Death thrived in the summer heat, while later plagues often subsided. It killed with a speed that baffled medieval observers, sometimes in a matter of hours. This alternative pathogen theory opens up a terrifying possibility that we are looking at a ghost, a highly evolved, incredibly lethal virus or bacterium that swept through a non-immune human population and then, for reasons we cannot understand, vanished. Could it have been an early form of a hemorrhagic fever, or was it something else, something unique? The records are maddeningly silent on key diagnostic details, written by terrified people who were describing what they saw not with the precision of a modern doctor, but with the apocalyptic language of divine punishment. They were not diagnosing a disease, they were documenting the end of the world. For decades, this debate was at a stalemate. The historical evidence was ambiguous, and there was no way to prove what pathogen caused the deaths. But then came the revolution of ancient DNA analysis. In the early 2000s, scientists began to successfully extract genetic material from the dental pulp of skeletons found in 14th century plague pits across Europe. In 2011, a landmark study confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis DNA in these victims. The case seemed to be closed once and for all. The textbook was right. It was the plague. But instead of ending the debate, the DNA evidence only deepened the mystery. The DNA evidence presents us with a profound paradox. We have found the murder weapon, Yersinia pestis, at the scene of the crime. But the crime itself, as described by eyewitnesses, does not seem to fit the weapon's known capabilities. How can we reconcile the genetic proof with the mountain of contradictory historical evidence? The answer may be that we have found the right killer, but we have completely misunderstood its nature. One possibility is that the 14th century strain of Yersinia pestis was fundamentally different from the one that exists today. It may have been a hyper-virulent, genetically distinct version of the bacterium that had evolved the ability to transmit through the air with an efficiency that modern strains lack. It might have been a super plague, a perfect storm of a pathogen that was both bubonic and pneumonic, capable of spreading through fleas and through the air. This could explain both the buboes and the terrifyingly rapid human-to-human transmission. After devastating the non-immune population of Europe, this superstrain could have then evolved back into the slower, less transmissible form we know today, or simply been driven to extinction, outcompeted by its less aggressive descendants. We may be looking at the fossilized remains of a killer that no longer walks the earth. Another piece of the puzzle lies not in the pathogen, but in the hosts. 14th century Europeans were not modern humans. They were, on the whole, malnourished and living in conditions of poor sanitation. But perhaps more importantly, there may have been a cofactor, another disease or environmental stressor that worked in tandem with the plague. Some scientists have proposed the idea of a plague plus model. Perhaps another unidentified virus was sweeping through Europe at the same time, weakening the population's immune systems and making them uniquely susceptible to Yersinia pestis, allowing it to spread in ways it otherwise couldn't. This would explain why the mortality was so high and the transmission so explosive, and why later plague outbreaks, though devastating, never reached the apocalyptic scale of the first wave. This leaves us in a place of profound uncertainty. The Black Death is no longer a simple story of rats and fleas. It is a complex biological mystery. It is a ghost in our genetic code, a killer whose methods remain shrouded in doubt. We know its name, Yersinia pestis, but we may never know its true face. The history of the Black Death is a chilling reminder that the past is not always a settled place. It holds secrets that our most advanced science can only begin to unravel. It reminds us that diseases can change, that they can evolve into forms more terrifying than we can imagine, and that the greatest killer in human history may still be, in some fundamental way, a terrifying unknown. The neat story is broken, and what remains in its place is a far more unsettling question. Not just what the Black Death was, but what else from the deep past might we have gotten wrong?